Well, after Lionsgate made all their money back on House of a Thousand Corpses, they approached Rob Zombie to develop a sequel, which turned out to be a horrific spin on a road trip western called The Devil's Rejects. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to my Firefly Trilogy review series. If you missed it, just a couple of days ago, I released my House of a Thousand Corpses review. Now we're at the middle chapter, and I believe 2 days from now, on Saturday, I'm scheduled to do 3 from Hell. So The Devil's Rejects was actually my introduction to Rob Zombie. I did not see House of a Thousand Corpses when it was first released to video, and certainly did not see it in the theaters. And I remember me and my dad renting this, and at this time, we had not seen the Texas Chainsaw movies. We really hadn't dove too much into 70s horror. I was pretty much raised on exclusively 80s stuff. And so this movie was way too much for us. We didn't really get a lot of the references, a lot of the inspiration that was building this world out. Rob Zombie's extreme weirdness when it comes to his script writing and some of the things that he chooses to show on screen. It was not a movie that I needed to see when I was 15 years old. A decade or so later, I finally revisited this film, found a lot more things that I enjoyed about it, and now just this past week I watched it for the 3rd time. And I gotta say, I understand why a lot of people call this Rob Zombie's best film. It's not my personal favorite, but there's a lot of things to appreciate in this movie, while still having some of the classic Rob Zombie pitfalls. So starting off with the positives for The Devil's Rejects, I actually think that this movie is the best utilization and the best versions of all 3 of these main characters, Otis, Baby, and of course Captain Spaulding. I think they get the best material here. I think they get the best standout scenes. I think the performances of all 3 actors are the best in this one compared to the other 2 films that bookend it. And I actually enjoy going along this really fucked up adventure on the road with them because they're all so very different. They're all psychotic, they're all depraved individuals, but they're very different flavors of depravity. You get Otis, who's very much like this kind of preacher character to where he wants to give these long monologues and just wrap a lot of really tasty words around just really sick, fucked up things. You got Baby, who is just kind of a loose cannon, and she's somebody that just seems to have fun and have just a blast just being as crazy as possible. And then you got Captain Spaulding that just has this very aggressive charm to him to where he's the father of Baby and he's a patriarch figure to Otis, but his relationship towards both of them is so antagonistic in a loving way that it's almost endearing the way that every single one of his conversations with them, he's like arguing with them in a way that's loving in some fucked up way.
What's the matter, kid? Don't you like clowns? Why? Don't we make you laugh? Aren't we fucking funny?
I still think Captain Spaulding is the standout character of this franchise, of this trilogy, and I appreciate the different scenes that we get with Sid Haig here. I love the scene whenever he takes the car away from the mom and the son, the way that he just has that jovial clown thing and then just kind of turns his eyes and the whole tone of his voice shifts. Very good stuff from Sid Haig. I could have gone without seeing his nutsack, but you watch a Rob Zombie film, hairy nutsack, saggy titties, and Sherry Moon's ass crack. It's kind of the price of admission. I actually like Sherry Moon Zombie in this movie. Holy fuck, it actually happened. I feel like either Sherry Moon herself or Rob Zombie as the director decided to really hone down and tone down the different extremities of the character of Baby, and so you don't get that really annoying grating laugh that you get in both 3 from Hell and especially House of a Thousand Corpses. You don't get these really weird lines of dialogue from Baby. She seems more like an actual human being in this film, and so I will say this alongside Lords of Salem are in competition with each other for performances from Sherry Moon Zombie that I would actually say she does a pretty good job, which if you know my history with this Rob Zombie filmography and the multitude of times that I have not liked her performance, that is saying a lot coming from me. And I really like what Bill Moseley brings to this too. Now there's a certain element to Otis that is just Bill Moseley doing his Bill Moseley thing. That is what he has been famous for ever since Chop Top and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Is a very similar style character, a very similar presence on screen, but where I felt like it was a little obnoxious in House of a Thousand Corpses with the run rabbit and just little things like that that's so Chop Top. and I'll get into my thoughts with 3 from Hell here in a couple of days, this actually feels like a character that's got a lot more working underneath the scene. You know, I wish they were developed a little bit more, I'll get into that, but it feels like there's a guy that's actually got some thoughts, got some things that he would want to say, and you would want to hear him as long as you're not going to be on the receiving end of his carnage. And these characters all get their little standout scenes, their moments to shine. Like I already said, the one with Captain Spaulding, Baby's got some really interesting stuff going on in this little hotel room, and even later on with some of her interactions with Rydell. And then Otis especially has that whole scene where he takes those 2 guys, the musicians, off into the desert to cover those guns up, or to dig the guns up, and you get these little monologue scenes with him. I'm the devil, I'm here to do the devil's work, and there's these moments that stand out that you actually remember these characters for, and they're all in this movie. I also think William Forsythe is awesome as Sheriff Rydell, who is the, I guess, antagonist of this story, but the protagonist as far as morals go. And he's a character actor that I always enjoy when he shows up. I always think that he brings a certain gravitas to the movie. Even if it's in a comedy, he's got a certain screen presence to him. And whenever he pops up in something where he gets to be this aggressive role, I think he really shines, unless he's talking about skull fucking Sherry Moon Zombie. Not so much that time, but in this movie, as the driving force that's going against the Firefly family, I think that he is got a lot of different layers to him that makes him a really interesting role for this story, to where he gets darker and more corrupt and more willing to break the law and break his own morals to snuff these people out, to where throughout the movie, he just continues to get different little edges and different little layers to what he's bringing, and I think that he's a nice counterpoint to the darkness that the Firefly family brings. Something that I've always appreciated with this movie, even the first time that I saw it, is that whoever does the blood, whoever mixes the corn syrup or whatever for Rob Zombie, especially in this film, does a really good job. Like, there's just some kind of a hue and a color to it that makes it look a lot more real than most horror movie gore. You know, there's something about it that looks like it's coagulating and it's drying as soon as it spills. And even though this is not an overly gory film, I think that of the trilogy, it might arguably be the least violent as far as the gore on screen, but whenever you do get blood and gore in The Devil's Rejects, I think it's pretty effective. I also appreciate Rob Zombie's signature editing in this movie, to where he stops on freeze frames and does the little side shuffle, you know, going back to films of the 70s. It's just one of those Rob Zombie ingredients that you're going to get in basically all of his movies, but for whatever reason, the tone and the direction he takes in The Devil's Rejects, I think that that editing style fits this movie more than it does most of his other films, maybe all of them. And so all of those little techniques that he does, even the opening credits and stopping on freeze frames, and the way that he ends the film in the final shots and everything, I just think that it's put together really well. This is a movie that I can understand to a degree why critics back in the day that were famous, almost infamous for despising horror films, despising slasher films, actually gave positive reviews to this, like Roger Ebert, because you do feel like The Devil's Rejects, whether it's your type of movie or not, is a filmmaker trying to make a piece of art. It may not be a piece of art you want to look at, but there's a lot more going on in this movie than I think a lot of his other films. And finally, I think he does a really good job at making you kind of root for the bad guys and making the bad guys be framed as the protagonists of this story. I mean, these 3 characters are doing some of the most sick and twisted and most depraved shit you can think of in the previous film as well as this one, and yet he still frames it in a way to where you enjoy being with them to an extent, and you kind of you root for them, and you almost want to see them survive these situations all the way through to the final reel of the movie, to where it has a bit of an emotional hit, even though if you were a real life person watching that, you'd be rooting for the opposite side. And again, with William Forsythe's performance, that's a guy who is doing good. He's a sheriff trying to get revenge for his brother's murder and take out these horrible, disgusting people, and yet the movie frames him like that bad guy, that looming threat that they have to avoid and eventually overcome in the third act. And it's really interesting. There's a number of movies that can do that, to where they make you root for the bad guy and you don't necessarily want them to fall victim to the law, even though they're doing bad things, but very rarely are they as extreme evil as the Firefly family. Usually they're just pretty cool or charismatic criminals, or an actor that you really enjoy, so you kind of attach that to the character as well. But the Firefly family are fucked up beyond belief, and somehow Rob Zombie still achieves a little bit of sympathy for them. As far as mixed aspects, I'm going to talk about the soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack itself is awesome. Again, one of those ingredients of Rob Zombie films. You're going to get a lot of 70s classic rock. And so I think the song choices themselves are great, and all the songs are great, but there is this bit of a trope that Rob Zombie has in some of his movies, and I think most prevalent in this one, to where he frames the entire scene to fit the song rather than framing the song to fit the scene. And so you'll get really long, drawn-out shit, like the final reel of the movie with Freebird, or even the opening title sequence, and I think there was one in the middle too that I'm forgetting the specificity on it, but he makes the song the star, and he makes the scene last as long as the song, even though it might draw way beyond the point that that scene should have lasted. He does it again in 31, he does it again in 3 from Hell, and we'll talk about that one. So it's something that he likes to do, but I just don't think that it fits. I don't think that it serves the movie very well when he does that. Moving on to the negatives, and this is going to sound a bit like a broken record because I feel like I say this with pretty much every Rob Zombie film, but the writing is still sketchy as fuck in this movie, predominantly with the dialogue. Now, there is scenes in this movie that fans seem to love. They're like fan favorite scenes, like the Tutti fucking Fruity scene, where I look at that and I'm looking at the dialogue where they're just over and over again, Tutti fucking Fruity, Tutti fucking Fruity, and everybody loves that scene that's a Rob Zombie fan. I watch it and I'm going, that's fucking weird. What is so stand out about that? It's just one phrase over and over and over again.
Tutti fucking fruity. Tutti fucking fruity. Tutti fucking fruity.
You got this sequence in the middle of the film where William Forsythe brings in this movie critic. That's just a very awkward dialogue exchange between them. It doesn't even really seem like it has much of a point in the movie. And then you get the signature, what the fuck, what point does this have sequence that is in every single Rob Zombie film, to where you get Ken Faree and Michael Berryman that go off, that are the patriarchs, the people that run this little whorehouse that they're hiding out in, and they have a whole sequence where they're discussing chicken fucking with this street vendor. Yeah, you fuck chickens? Hey, I don't really have nothing against fucking chickens. You know, if you cut their head off and you just stick them on there and they go wild. And I'm like, what point does this serve in the movie, aside from being gross? What point does this, in driving the plot forward and developing any of these characters and achieving anything, does this scene do, aside from just being fucking weird and gross? There is moments like that in almost every single Rob Zombie movie where I look at it and I go, dude, what the fuck is going on in your head when you write this shit? Like, you know what this movie needs right now? A scene about chicken fucking.
Do you fuck chickens? Well, I have thought about fucking some chicken before.
I said it in my House of a Thousand Corpses review. Rob Zombie is trying to be the Quentin Tarantino of like 70s grindhouse horror. And Tarantino can have these weird, completely out of place, seemingly on paper pointless scenes of dialogue in his films that become standout moments because it just doesn't necessarily develop the characters sometimes, but it fleshes out the world, or it gives you an idea of the attitude of the characters. It does something to develop a piece of what is going on, whether it's so far removed from the point of the film or not. When Rob Zombie tries to do that, it's just a commercial break of fucking chicken fried weirdness. I also think that the middle act of this film meanders quite a bit. You get the first act to where you have the siege on the Firefly house, you have the escape of Otis and Baby, you've got Captain Spaulding on the run and they're trying to get together. The third act is where they're trying to survive and escape from Sheriff Rydell. The middle act is basically all in this hotel room, to where they take this little traveling band hostage and they rape and torture and murder them for an entire like 30-minute stretch of the film. And again, along with the writing, I just don't really understand what that entire middle act purpose is, aside from just showing rape and murder and violence. It's to the point where it makes me feel like Rob Zombie may have written this movie in a rush, or didn't have a complete idea for a movie. He kind of knew where he wanted to start, knew where he wanted to end, and then in the middle he just filled it out with some nasty shit. And I don't enjoy that segment of the film for multitudes of reasons. When you have things like sexual assault and torture and violence in horror films, most of the time you can find a purpose for that. You know, there's people that will argue that the sexual assault stuff never has a place, and I don't necessarily disagree with them for the most part, but in this movie, it just kind of feels like it's there because It's expected. You don't learn anything about this band. You don't have any kind of character development with them. There's no tension involved with, are they going to survive, or is one of them going to get the upper hand on Baby or Otis? Because just like with House of a Thousand Corpses, it's completely hopeless. You know when you're watching these movies that any innocent person that these three come across are completely fucked and they're not getting out of it. And so all of the reasons why a sequence like this normally would exist in a film that's going for horror and torture and depravity, I think this one lacks all of that, and it's just there to be there. And kind of going along with that, I'm somebody that just doesn't really enjoy watching movies that are dirty and nasty and gross and depraved for the sake of it. I mean, even the well-beloved original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a film that has never really been one of my favorites, and is certainly not a film that I reach and grab off of my shelf very often. And I kind of fit this even more so into that category of movie, to where even though there's so many things I appreciate about it, it's just not a movie I particularly enjoy watching all that much. It's not something that I have a craving to experience again very often. And my final negative, which is something that's small, but it's also something that seems weird to talk about in a Rob Zombie film, which is typically lower budget, a little bit scaled down, more grindhouse, back to bare bones filmmaking, is that there's some digital CGI effects in this movie that are pretty rough, and would have looked even the same amount of rough in 2005 when this came out, but really stood out to me when I watched it this time. There's an effect where Baby throws a knife across the room and it hits a woman in the chest, to where the knife and the blood is very clearly digital, and it just looks very wonky. And there's a sequence in the third act to where the characters are all strapped to chairs while this room is on fire, and it's blatantly obvious that the fire is digital effects. I mean, it's just like you can see the layers and everything when you look at it. And so that took me out of the movie a bit. When I watch Rob Zombie movies, I never thought that I was going to be bitching about CG effects, but here we are. But overall, guys, as far as Rob Zombie movie experiences go, there's actually a lot more about Devil's Rejects that I can find that I enjoy and that I appreciate than the majority of his other films. I still don't think it's the proven classic that a lot of you fans call it. I still don't think it's necessarily his best film like a lot of you guys seem to call it, but it is one of the extreme few films that he has made that I would actually give a positive review for and recommend it to very certain individuals. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for the rest of my Rob Zombie reviews, and I'm also going to put my top 50 horror films up here for you to check out as well. Please like and share this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the 3 from Hell review coming in 2 days, as well as my Rob Zombie ranking this Sunday. Thank you for watching as always, and remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.